Well, let's get started on the actual material. Somebody asked, what is the role of moonlight and fire? I'm presuming they mean fireplace or candle or things of that sort. In setting circadian rhythms, is it okay to view moonlight at night, or will that wake me up? Will a fire in my fireplace or using candlelight be too much light? Great question. Also offers me the opportunity to share with you what I think is a quite beautiful definition of what light is in a quantitative sense. So I've mentioned a few times the use of apps and light meters and things to measure things like lux, which sometimes are also described in terms of candelas. So those are the two units for measuring light intensity. Typically lux, L-U-X, is the unit. And so before we go forward and discuss this many lux or that many lux, I want to just tell you what a lux is because it relates to this question. 1 lux equals the illumination of 1 square meter surface at 1 meter away from a single candle. Think about that. So somebody actually decided at some point that the amount of illumination at 1 square meter surface 1 meter away from a single candle, that equals 1 lux. So when we talk about 6,000 lux of light intensity or 10,000 lux of light intensity, now you have a kind of a reference or a framework that would be the equivalent of, you could think of it as 6,000 candles all with their light intensity shown on 1 square meter from 1 meter's distance away. Or, of course, if it was a different number of lux, it would be a different number of candles. So you get the idea. Here's the great thing. Turns out that moonlight, candlelight, and even a fireplace, if you have one of these roaring fires going in the fireplace, do not reset your circadian clock at night and trick your brain into thinking that it's morning. Even though, if you've ever sat close to a fireplace or even a candle, that light seems very bright. And there are 2 reasons for that are very important. The first one is that these neurons in your eye that I discussed in the previous episode, these melanopsin ganglion cells, also called intrinsically photosensitive ganglion cells, those cells adjust their sensitivity across the day. And those cells respond best to the blue-yellow contrast present in the rising and setting sun, so-called low solar angle sun, also discussed in the previous episode. But those cells adjust their sensitivity such that they will not activate the triggers in the brain that convey daytime signals when they view moonlight, even a full moon, a really bright moon, or fire. Now, this does raise an interesting kind of thought point, which is, a lot of people have talked about lunacy and the fact that when there's a full moon out, people act differently and behave differently. There's a lot of lore around that. There's actually a little bit of quality science around that maybe we can address in the future. But moonlight is typically not going to wake us up too much, except maybe if the moon is really full and really bright, there's possibility for that. So provided you're not going to burn down the structure you're in, you're not going to burn down the forest, enjoy your fireplaces, enjoy your lights from candles, and those are perfectly safe without disrupting your circadian rhythm. Because we talked about just how crucial it is to avoid bright lights between the hours of about 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., except when you need to view things for sake of safety or work or so and so forth. I also received a lot of questions about red light. Now, I think I was asked those questions because red light is used in a number of different commercial products where these products tend to include a sheet of very bright red lights that one is supposed to view early in the day. And there are various claims attached to these red light devices that they improve mitochondrial function, that they improve metabolism. I'm going to be really honest, and I can't name brands, and I'm not going to name particular studies because what I'm about to say about these studies is not particularly unkind, but let's just say that none of the studies that I've seen, except for one that I'll talk about in a moment, pointing to the positive effects of red light on the visual system are published in blue ribbon journals. They tend to be published in journals that I had to work hard to find. I'm not sure what the peer review and stringency level is. Now, that's not to say red light isn't beneficial, because there is one study in particular that came from Glenn Jeffrey's lab at the University of College London. It was published last year. Glenn is somebody I happen to know, has an excellent reputation, excellent vision scientist. What this study essentially showed, and again, this is a study that I very much like the data and think it was done with very high standards. What this study shows is that viewing red light for a few minutes each morning can have positive effects on mitochondria in a particular retinal cell type that tends to degenerate or decline in function with age in humans. And that cell type is the photoreceptor. The photoreceptor is a type of cell in your eye that sits at the back of the eye. It's kind of some distance away from the ganglion cells, and it's the cell that converts light information into electrical signals that the rest of the retina and brain can understand. These are vitally important cells. Without them, people are blind. And many people's vision gets worse with age, in particular age-related macular degeneration, but also related to some other factors, including photoreceptor functionality just getting worse with time. And what Glenn showed was that red light flashes delivered in particular early in the day, but not late in the day, can help repair the mitochondria. Now, this study needs more support from additional studies, of course. They are doing a clinical trial. They did report on what I think it was 12 patients. And so the work is ongoing, but that was very interesting. And it points to some potentially really useful things about red light. However, most of the questions I got about red light for sake of office hours were about the use of red light later in the day. So here's the deal. In principle, red light will not stimulate the melanopsin retinal neurons that wake up the brain and circadian clock and signal daytime. However, most of the red lights, in particular the red lights that come on these sheets of these products that people are supposed to view them in order to access a number of proclaimed health effects, those are way too bright and would definitely wake up your body and brain. So if you're going to use those products, and I'm not suggesting you do or you don't, but if that's your thing, you would want to use those early in the day. Who knows? You might even derive some benefit on mitochondrial function in these photoreceptors. But if you're thinking about red light for sake of avoiding the negative effects of light later in the day and at night, then you want that red light to be very, very dim, certainly much dimmer than is on most of those commercial products. Now, do you need red lights? No, although red lights are rather convenient because you can see pretty well with them on, but if they're dim, they won't wake up the circadian clock. They won't have this dopamine disrupting thing that we talked about in the previous podcast. So there's a role for red light potentially early in the day and for mitochondrial repair in the photoreceptors. There's a role for dim red light later in the day and at night. So you're starting to notice a theme here, which is that there's no immediate prescription of look at these lights. It's look at these lights potentially, if that's what you want to do, at particular times of day and with particular intensities. It brings us back to the blue light issue, which is so many people are obsessed with avoiding blue light, but you actually want a ton of blue light early in the day and throughout the day. So don't wear your blue blockers then, or maybe even don't wear them at all. And at night, it doesn't matter if you have blue blockers on. If the lights are bright enough, then you're still going to be activating these cells and mechanisms. I just want to add something since about the science behind the blue blocker confusion. So these melanopsin retinal cells do react to blue light. That is the best stimulus for one of these melanopsin cells, which led to the belief that blue blockers would be a good thing for preventing resetting of the circadian clock at night and deleterious effects of screens, etc. However, the people that made these products failed to actually read the papers start to finish, or if they did, they didn't comprehend a critical element, which is that most of those papers early on took those neurons out and put them in a dish. And when they did that, they divorced those neurons from their natural connections in the eye. Turns out in your eye and my eye right now, because that's what we care about, these cells exist. And these cells respond to blue light, but also to other wavelengths of light because they not only respond directly to light as they do in a dish, they also respond to input from photoreceptors. So if you talk to anyone in the circadian biology field, they'll tell you, oh, yeah, this blue light thing has really gotten out of control because people assume that blue light is the culprit because blue light is the best stimulus. That doesn't mean that blue light is the only stimulus that will trigger these cells. Okay, so like many things, a scientific paper can be accurate without being exhaustive, and a lot of claims about products can be accurate but not exhaustive. So blue light during the day is great. Get that screen light, get that sunlight especially, get overhead lights. I talked about all this in the previous podcast. But at night, you really want to avoid those bright lights, and it doesn't matter if it's blue light or something else. And so there was a real confusion about the papers and the data when most of those product recommendations were made. Okay, while we're on that topic, let's talk about light in other orifices of the body. I made a kind of a joke about this the last podcast episode, but a couple of people wrote to me and said, well, I've seen some claims that light delivered to the ears, into the ears or the roof of the mouth or up the nose can be beneficial for setting circadian rhythms. No, not directly anyway. And this is a great opportunity for us to distinguish between what is commonly called the placebo effect, but a more important way to think about any manipulation, behavioral or otherwise, that you might do is the difference between modulation and mediation. There are a lot of things that will modulate your biology. Putting a couple of lights up your nose, please don't do this, might modulate your biology by way of the stress hormone that's released when you stuff those things up your nose. Remember earlier, in the previous podcast, I said that virtually anything will phase shift your circadian rhythm if it's different and dramatic enough. So the question is it the light delivered up the nose or through the ears or some other orifice that's mediating the process? Is it actually tapping into the natural biology of the system that you're trying to manipulate? And this is where I like to distinguish between real biology and hacks. I don't like the word hack or, frankly, neurohacking or biohacking. I just don't like the term, because a hack is using something for a purpose for which it was not intended, right? But where you can it's a kind of a cheat. And that's not how biology works well. So I try and distinguish between things that really mediate biological processes and things that modulate them. There are a number of commercial products out there with some studies attached to them claiming that light delivered to the ears or wherever can adjust your wakefulness or adjust your sleep. I've looked at those papers. Again, I'm probably going to lose some friends by saying this, but maybe I'll gain a few as well. Not blue ribbon journals, frankly. Oftentimes, read the small print. There was a conflict of interest clause there related to commercial interests. If somebody disagrees with me outright on this and can send to me a peer-reviewed paper published in a quality journal about light delivered anywhere but the eyes of humans that can mediate circadian rhythms, wakefulness, etc., I'm more than happy to take a look at that and change my words and stance on this and do it publicly, of course. But until then, I'm guessing that the proper controls were not done of adjusting for heat that could be delivered, which can definitely shift circadian rhythms. We're going to talk about temperature and other things like that. So light to the eyes, folks, is where these light effects work in humans. In other animals, they have extraocular photoreception. In humans, no. And just be mindful. I mean, I'm not trying to encourage people to avoid certain products in particular, but just be mindful of this difference between modulation and mediation, and mediating a process through a hardwired or long-standing biological mechanism is really where you're going to see the powerful effects over time. I also, as you've probably noticed, I really tend to favor behavioral tools and zero-cost tools first, and getting those dialed in before you start, plugging in and swallowing and, putting things in various places, just to really figure out how your biology works and explore that, unless there's, of course, a clinical need to take a prescribed drug, in which case, by all means, listen to your doctor. Okay, a huge number of people asked me about what about light through windows, and I actually did an Instagram post about this. Look, setting your circadian clock with sunlight coming through a window is going to take 50 to 100 times longer. If you want the data on that, I'd be happy to send you to the various papers that were described in the previous podcast that Jamie Zeitzer from Stanford and I have discussed also elsewhere. But here's really the key thing with this. Do the experiment. You can download the free app Light Meter. You can have a bright day outside or some sunlight. Hold up that app, take a picture. It'll tell you how many lux. Now you know what lux are. It will tell you how many lux are in that environment. Now close the window. And if you want, close the screen or don't open the screen. You can do all sorts of experiments. And you'll see that it will at least half the amount of lux. And it doesn't scale linearly, meaning let's say I get 10,000 lux outside, 5,000 looking out through an open window, and then I close the window and it's 2,500 lux. It does not mean that you just need to view that sunlight for twice as long if it's half as many lux, okay? It's not like 2,500 lux means you need to look for 10 minutes and 5,000 lux means you look for 5 minutes. It doesn't scale that way just because the biology doesn't work that way. Best thing to do is to get outside if you can. If you can't, next best thing to do is to keep that window open. It is perfectly fine to wear prescription lenses and contacts. Why is it okay to wear prescription lenses and contacts when those are glass also, but looking through a window diminishes the effect? Well, we should think about this. The lenses that you wear in front of your eyes by prescription or on your eyes are designed to focus the light onto your neural retina. In fact, that's what nearsightedness is when the image, because your lens doesn't work quite right, the image falls in front of the neural retina. Wearing a particular lens in front of that focuses the lens onto your retina, onto these very neurons, so they can communicate that to the brain. Costello's loving this. He's deep in sleep. And maybe we could play him some tones and he'll remember it later based on the studies we're going to talk about in a little bit. I don't know how we'd know if he remembered it or not, but prescription lenses are fine. In fact, they're great for this reason. They're actually focusing the light onto the retina. So think about this logically, and all of a sudden it makes perfect sense. Your glass window or your windshield or the side window of your car, it isn't optically perfect to bring the image and the light onto your retina. In fact, what it's doing is it's scattering and filtering light, in particular the wavelengths of light that you want. So if you live in a low light environment, lots of questions about this. We talked about this the previous podcast, but just get outside for longer or use really bright lights inside. Okay, so let's think about why I'm making some of these recommendations, because I think it can really empower you with the ability to change your behavior in terms of light viewing and other things, depending on time of year, depending on other lifestyle factors. The important point to understand is that early in the day, your central circadian clocks and all these mechanisms are looking for a lot of light. I mean, they don't have a mind of their own, but it needs a lot of light to trigger this daytime signal, alertness, etc. And early in the day, but not in the middle of the day, you can sum or add photons. So there's this brief period of time early in the day when the sun is low in the sky, when your brain and body are expecting a morning wake-up signal, where let's say it's not that bright outside. Someone sent me a picture or a little movie of their walk in England, and it was pretty overcast, and they were using light meter, and they said it's only about 700 lux or maybe even less. And I said, well, stay outside longer, but when you get inside, turn on the lights really bright, and overhead lights in particular, because those will be best for stimulating these mechanisms. And that's because, at least for the first few hours of the day, you can continue to sum or add photon activation of these cells in the eye and the brain. In the middle of the day, once the sun is overhead, or even if you stay inside all morning, and then you're in the circadian dead zone, which sounds terrible, and it is terrible because doesn't matter if you get a ton of artificial light or even sunlight, you're not going to shift your circadian clock. You're not going to get that wake-up signal. And then in the evening, you want to think about this whole system as being vulnerable to even a few photons of light, because your sensitivity to light really goes up at night. And I talked last time about how you can protect against that sensitivity by looking at the setting sun and watching the evening sun, even if it's not crossing the horizon, around the time of sunset. And that's because it adjusts your retinal sensitivity and your melatonin pathways so that light is not as detrimental to melatonin at night. Think about the afternoon sunlight viewing as kind of I think of it as kind of a Netflix inoculation. It allows me to watch a little bit of Netflix in the evening. Although it's very hard to watch a little bit of anything on Netflix. It seems like there's some other neurobiological process going on there where I have to watch episode after episode or after episode. But in any case, you can protect yourself against some of that bad effect of light at night by looking at light in the evening. It really does adjust down the sensitivity of the system. Okay, I want to talk about seasonal changes in all these things as they relate to mood and metabolism. So depending on where you are in the world, northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, at the equator, or closer to the poles, the days and nights are going to be different lengths. That just makes sense. But that translates to real biological signals that impact everything from wakefulness and sleep times, but also mood and metabolism. So here's how this works. Now, after seeing the previous episode of the podcast and paying attention here, you are armed with the knowledge to really understand how it is that, believe it or not, every cell in your body is tuned to the movement of the planet relative to the sun. So as all of you know, the Earth spins once every 24 hours on its axis. So part of that day we're bathed in sunlight, depending on where we are. The other half of the day or part of the day we're in darkness. The Earth also travels around the sun.